Welcome, everyone, to this afternoon's session at the 6th Annual Pathways to Hope Conference. My name is Mary Beth Fisk, and I will serve during this workshop as a moderator and also a speaker at the very end. Please be reminded to share your first name and zip code and any speaker-related questions or specific questions and comments into either the Q&A or the chat box this afternoon. Again, we welcome you all. And we'll get started with a little housekeeping. I'm sure you've heard this if you've been in the conference this morning, but we want to share that at each of the workshops. If you're attending the conference to receive CEUs, please listen carefully. All registered attendees seeking CEUs must remain in the session for the entire duration. These sessions are approximately 75 minutes long, so it's 1.25 CEUs that will be issued upon approval in the areas for LPCs, LMFT, social workers, and psychologists. Each attendee can qualify for a total of 4 CEUs during the workshops on Friday and Saturday. A post-session survey will be required, as well as a daily conference evaluation. For those of you joining from out of state, please follow your CEU instructions, but it will be your responsibility to seek final approval for your state's credentialing board. We're grateful for the support of NAMI Texas and to Bexar County Recast Project for making the CEUs available to each individual requiring those. Again, be reminded that if seeking CEUs, you must stay in the conference for the duration of the conference this afternoon. And it's now my distinct honor and privilege to introduce to you our outstanding panelists for today and speakers. To begin with, I'll give all of their introductions now, and then we'll proceed through the presentation. We have Dr. Colleen Bridger. Dr. Bridger was appointed as the Assistant City Manager on July 16th of 2019 and Interim Health Director on June 26, 2020. She has had oversight of the Metropolitan Health District, Parks and Recreation, and the Department of Health Services. She was named Director of the San Antonio Metropolitan Health District in March of 2017, where she was responsible for implementing policies and programs aimed at improving the health of the population in San Antonio and Bexar County. Prior to joining the health department, Dr. Bridger was the director of the Stokes County from 1997 to 2002, Gaston County from 2002 to 2010, and Orange County 2011 to 2017 health departments in North Carolina. As a health director, she tackled tough issues like poverty, transportation, and access to care, and exceeded community goals for reductions in teen pregnancy and infant mortality rates. Under her leadership, the health departments won numerous awards, including multiple Ralph Kenter Awards for Innovation in Government and a multiple GlaxoSmithKline Child Health Recognition Awards. Prior to becoming a local health director, she worked as a social worker for Spanish-only speaking pregnant women and as a health systems researcher in the state of North Carolina and international development organizations. She's a nationally recognized speaker. She is a trainer and an innovation expert. Dr. Bridger brings 25 years of experience in community development and improvement. Dr. Bridger will lead us in several segments of our talk today. Our second speaker is Mr. Randy McGibeny. He has served as the Chief Program Officer and Chief Operating Officer of ChildSafe for the past 10 years, where he oversees the Forensic Interview Program, Client Services Program, Counseling Program, Adventure Therapy Program, Child Sex Trafficking Care Coordination Program, and ChildSafe's the many disciplinary teams. He's worked as an advocate for children for the past 24 years in our community. Prior to working for ChildSafe, he worked for Bexar County Battered Women and Children's Shelter as a Director of Children's Services. He also worked at our local mental health authority, Center for Healthcare Services, where he oversaw and directed multiple children's programs while working at the battered women's shelter. Randy turned his attention to providing trauma-informed care and trauma-specific services to children impacted by trauma and violence in their communities. I thank you for speaking today, my colleagues on the call, and Dr. Bridger, the microphone is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Waiting for the slides to come up, and apologizing for any background thunder and lightning that you may be hearing because there's a lot going on right now. So yes, I am honored to be part of this 3-person panel looking at kind of a basic just primer on ACEs, and then diving a little bit deeper into what we're doing here in San Antonio specific to creating a trauma-informed community complete with certification in trauma-informed care. So I'm going to kick it off and just level set everybody on ACEs. So next slide, please. ACEs are not new. They've been around for over 20 years. And the framework that we use to talk about ACEs is kind of a 3-category or a 3 different buckets. So in the first bucket is child abuse. The second one is child neglect. And those are things that people typically think about when they think of adverse childhood experiences. But then there's this whole other category of household dysfunction. And so that's if there is somebody with a mental illness in the household, if there's domestic violence in the household, if there's been divorce, or if a parent left the house because of incarceration, and then if there is substance abuse. So all of those things kind of make up the 10 basic adverse childhood experiences. And as the field has kind of matured and become, I think, a little more nuanced in its understanding of childhood trauma, we've added more types of examples of what an adverse childhood experience is, but this gives you a good framework or a good grounding in what we're talking about. Next slide, please. So it's important to recognize that, you know, when Randy and I started talking about this, there weren't a lot of people who had heard of it, even though ACEs are quite common. And a lot of the information that we know about ACEs came from a study that was done 20-some years ago, where they looked at individuals who were pretty solidly middle class, who had health insurance, who had jobs. And what they found was that 64% of the 17,000 people that participated in this study had at least one adverse childhood experience. And almost 13% had 4 or more ACEs. Next slide, please. So why do we care about adverse childhood experiences? It's basically because ACEs cause toxic stress. And toxic stress is one of those terms out there that a lot of people use, and a lot of people use it to mean different things. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with what we mean in the context of ACEs. So when you think about kids and you think about the types of stress that kids deal with in their lives, there's 3 different types of stress. The first is positive stress or good stress. So that may be something like you're studying for a spelling test and you're really, really nervous because, you know, you're in 1st grade and this is your first spelling test and you know you studied really hard and you should know it, but you're scared, right? That's good stress. That's the kind of stress that stretches and grows kids into healthy, resilient adults. Then the next one is tolerable stress, or stress that is short term and then is buffered by adult support. So the example I like to use with this is the death of a grandparent, for example. That's something that is really stressful for a child to deal with, causes a lot of intense emotions. But generally speaking, there are rituals around the funeral and the religious ceremony associated with burial, where lots of other adults in that child's life can come together and check in with that child. That child can see that there are other people who are feeling these same types of emotions, and that that's okay. We're also very comfortable talking about that as a culture. So, oh, I'm sorry your grandpa died, how are you feeling, is not anything that anybody feels nervous or afraid to broach. And then there's toxic stress. And so the difference between toxic stress and tolerable stress in a child's life is two-part. One, it's capricious. So it comes and goes, and the child never knows when it's going to come and go. He just knows that it has come and gone before. And then two, there isn't that adult support to help him process and understand what's happening. The example that I can use here is domestic violence. So if there's domestic violence in the home, that's something that's very scary for that child to witness. He can't, let's say in this example that it is the father who is beating the mother. He can't talk to his dad about the feelings that he has about that because he's afraid of his father and making him more mad. And he can't really talk to his mom about the feelings that he has about that because his mom is scared and he wants to, put up a brave face and not scare her anymore or cause her any more distress. And so he internalizes those feelings and doesn't talk about them with anybody else. That's what we're talking about when we talk about toxic stress. So next slide, please. And so then the next question is, well, what is it about toxic stress that we're particularly worried about? And that's where we start to see the changes in the brain architecture of these kids. So, what happens when kids are experiencing toxic stress is they're experiencing this on again, off again, fight or flight response in their bodies. And when that happens enough, that's bathing those children's brains and bodies in those stress hormones that can cause their brains to wire differently. So if you look at the pictures at the bottom of this screen, the picture on the left is of a 3-year-old child with a typically developing picture of a neuron. And you can see lots and lots of spaghetti connections, lots of duplication. It's exactly what we like to see in a 3-year-old's brain's neurons. And then the picture on the right is of a 3-year-old, but who has experienced significant toxic stress. And what you see here are fewer duplicative connections, less of that spaghetti effect, and already these kind of stronger trunks or branches of the neuron that are reinforcing this worldview that the child has, that the world is a dangerous place, and that they need to be constantly on guard and on alert for danger. And ultimately, what that produces is behavior. If you think about these kids in the classroom, behavior in the classroom that could be perceived as inappropriate. So for example, you may have Johnny who's sitting at his desk. He has a high ACE score, and one of his friends walks into the classroom and looks at him for maybe 1 or 2 seconds longer than usual. And she's looking at him because she's thinking, has Johnny got a haircut? But what Johnny perceives is that that's a threat, that friend of his is studying him because she is looking for an opportunity to do him harm. And so what can happen with these kids is that they can react to protect themselves. So his quote unquote inappropriate behavior could be something like pushing the desk between himself and his friend. It could be yelling at his friend. It could be running away. But all of those things are not things that you like to have in your first grade classroom, for example. The other thing that we see is that the prefrontal cortex of the brain of these children who are constantly dealing with this fear, the prefrontal cortex, which is where the brain processes kind of those executive functions, like, if I sit still for the next 5 minutes, then I can go out to recess. That area of the brain doesn't develop along the same timeline as other kids, because the brain is processing information about the fact that it needs to protect itself right now. It doesn't need to worry about the future. So the development is happening around what do I need to do to be safe right now? And ultimately that results in weaker impulse control and shorter attention spans in these kids, which again can be challenging in the classroom. Next slide, please. So the other thing that happens is where the brain goes, the body follows, right? And so as these stress hormones are being produced and are flooding the body, it's causing problems in the behaviors that these kids, as they get a little bit older, are dealing with. And so when these kids start to get a little bit older, they look for ways to stop feeling afraid. And some of the ways that they find aren't necessarily healthy ways. So it leads to a much higher risk for smoking, for substance use disorder, for other addictive behaviors, because when they're engaged in those types of behaviors is when they have kind of stopped that constant state of fear and anxiety. Next slide, please. So what we see from the research is quite simply a dose-response relationship between the number of adverse childhood experiences and the risk of chronic disease, obesity, diabetes. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Also in risky behaviors, smoking, alcoholism, anything that could be addictive. And then just a general decrease in life potential. The higher your ACE score is, the less likely you are to graduate from high school or college, and the less likely you are to be successful at holding down a fulfilling career. Next slide, please. So this is something that often gives people pause. So when you look at the risk of death, top 10 leading causes of death here in the United States, you can see the list. The number one cause of death is heart disease. All of us are familiar with going to the doctor and having our cholesterol checked. That is just kind of routine part of your annual physical exam. And if it comes back high, your doctor will talk to you about the fact that you're at higher risk for heart disease if you have high cholesterol. The thing that people don't realize is that when you have high cholesterol, your risk of developing heart disease is about 40% higher than somebody who has normal cholesterol. What this chart is telling us is that if you have an ACE score of 4, your risk of developing heart disease is about 200% greater than a person who doesn't have a high ACE score. And yet it's interesting, we've known this information for a couple of decades, and rarely do people go to their primary care doctor and have conversations with them about what their risks are for heart disease or any of these other items because of trauma that happened during their childhood. So, I just like to use this to kind of ground people in the understanding of this isn't just about mental health. This is about chronic disease in adulthood that roots begin in trauma that happened in childhood. Next slide, please. So the CDC has looked at this, and they have crunched some numbers, and they estimate that if we could, in the United States, prevent this childhood trauma, we could actually decrease significant numbers of depression, heart disease, and overweight and obesity. Not to mention some of the employment and education challenges, and the health risk behaviors associated with smoking and drinking. So I think with that, we're going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Randy.
Sorry, guys, I had to unmute myself there. Thank you, Colleen. So I wanted to talk to you guys just a couple minutes today, really about why this is important, and why creating a trauma-informed system inside of communities is really important, and really talk about some of the common languages and missteps that I think that we have a tendency as clinicians or providers of these services to children and these individuals who have experienced trauma that we often make. And so one of the first things that I really wanted to talk about, though, is Colleen did a really good job of laying out what the adverse childhood experiences are. But I want to talk about the prevalence rate of those. The prevalence rate of children who have experienced an adverse childhood experience or experienced some kind of trauma in the United States is roughly half. Roughly half the children in our country have experienced some kind of traumatic event at some point in their life. And when you look at the long-term impacts that the adverse childhood experiences study shows that has on children's long-term development, the reliance on our community systems is extremely heavy, and it burdens our community systems. So we, as a community of service providers to these youth and children, I feel it's incumbent upon us to intervene at the earliest possible point that we can and provide the most effective types of services that we can provide to these children in order to create a true trauma-informed system for all of these youth and to help them overcome these long-term adverse experiences. The thing that we have to do is we have to have an integrated approach. And we don't necessarily have an integrated approach right now. What we have is we have silos that are working the best that we possibly can with children. So creating a system of care or creating a community that is trauma-informed provides the opportunity to create integrative services where we can come together and intervene and provide the most effective service to these youth and children as they move forward. The other thing about this is that if you're working in a silo, then one hand is not necessarily washing the other. So let me give you an example. Let's say that I have a youth or a child who is a victim of a murder-suicide, is it not a victim, but is a witness to a murder-suicide between his or her caregivers inside the home. The police officer shows up, is trauma-informed, does a really, really, really good job of working with that youth and allows that child to grab their favorite picture of mom and dad, allows that child to grab a teddy bear that they feel is extremely important or that comforts them when they sleep at night. And the only place that they can take them is to the local shelter, whatever shelter that is housing youth and children. And upon entry into the shelter environment during intake, the intake specialist says, well, you can't have that picture because there's glass in that and that's a cutting risk. So they take the picture away. And they say, you can't bring in outside stuffed animals because those haven't been washed or those haven't been taken care of. And before you can have this, we've got to put it through our requirement for cleaning. And so all the wonderful things that this police officer did in order to comfort this child in this horrific time in their life were just entirely taken away from them and entirely removed from them. And those are the little things that we do when we come across youth and children that help them get through that moment. And we never know when we're going to have the greatest impact on a child's life. So I want to take a minute here and just kind of talk about the differences, because when we're building trauma-informed care and we're building trauma-informed systems, I believe it's a bottom-up approach. I believe that what we first have to do is attend conferences like this, and we have to engage one another and have these conversations, right? So that we become trauma-informed, right? And that's what I mean about trauma-informed versus trauma-sensitive and trauma-aware. There's a lot of different kind of languages that are thrown around out there to really describe what this is. But you participating in an adverse childhood experiences training, going to learn about the impacts of trauma on children, and how you can build resiliency in those youth and children, is making you trauma-informed. But that doesn't make your organization trauma-informed, right? It doesn't make the system that you work in trauma-informed. It makes you trauma-informed. And so that happens on a micro level, right? Your education of that. And then there's this thing called trauma-specific services. And these are these therapeutic type services that we give to children, again, that are to a individual service provider and that are evidence-based and show positive outcomes and reduction in trauma symptomology. So trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, child and family traumatic stress intervention, parent-child interaction therapy. These types of therapeutic services that are provided to youth and children that specifically target the trauma symptomology and reduce the trauma inside of that child, right? They've been evidence-based. They've been shown through research to show that that's going to happen, right? Those are oftentimes provided by therapists, community-based therapists, people inside of organizations that take it upon themselves to attend some type of training, whatever it may be. And yet we're still not building a trauma-informed system. We're still building individuals who are trauma-informed, but we're broadening the spectrum here, right? And then we have to create systems, and the systems themselves are macro. As the chief operating officer of an organization, a nonprofit local organization here, we decide, hey, we want our organization to become trauma-informed. Okay, well, what does that look like? Well, that's a macro level inside of our organization. And what we're trying to do is create policy and procedure that will dictate the type of therapists that we hire. So, for example, we only want to hire therapists who are trained in trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. That's a policy that we have. Well, if you're interested in getting that training, we'll get you trained on that, but you have to be willing as a therapist to work in that modality to work for our organization. That is us creating policy and pushing that culture down through our organization so that we start to create our organization as becoming trauma-informed. And when you have multiple organizations that are doing that, and they are like-minded organizations that are providing services to children, now you can begin to create systems of care. But we all have to be on the same page with what the language is. Mary Beth, can you take the next slide, please? So this is what being trauma-informed is. This is exactly what I was saying. It's the individual who really has a clear understanding of the impacts of trauma on the children that they're serving, the youth and children and adults that they're actually serving, right? And being able to understand what triggers those individuals. Right now, what we have is a system of care that works in silos that isn't built to manage or handle children who get triggered inside of their organizations. I'll take the school system, for example. If I have a child who has experienced some kind of traumatic event and was sexually assaulted by their caregiver at the age of 10 at 2 o'clock in the morning every single night, from the age of 8 to 10, and that caregiver assaulted her at 2 o'clock in the morning every single night on Thursday because that's the time they came home from work. And because they worked so late, they drank a bunch of coffee, right? And every time he sexually assaulted her, maybe he triggers her, or maybe the smell of the coffee causes her to disassociate from what's happening to her, right? The sexual assault causes her to disassociate, and she smells that coffee and him being on top of her. Now she's inside of the classroom and she's disassociating inside of the classroom as a stress response because that's what worked for her when she was experiencing some kind of stress. And the teacher squats down in front of her and says, I'd like for you to tell me what the problem is. Why aren't you paying attention to me inside my classroom? And the child gets a whiff of coffee. That triggers the child inside of the classroom. Now there's a disciplinary reaction that begins, and that child is removed from the classroom because the caregiver or the teacher inside of the classroom isn't trauma informed and doesn't understand what triggers are and doesn't understand what the child's history is. And so therefore there's a community response or a systemic response inside of the classroom that you discipline children who misbehave inside of your classroom. And now we have children who aren't getting the education that they should be getting inside of the classrooms that they should be in. So really being trauma informed is about training individuals who understand what these triggers are, right? And they can manage those types of things in various environments. Next slide, Mary Beth. So it's also a multi-layered process. These are the things I was talking about earlier. You can be a service provider, you can be trauma informed and provide trauma specific services. Those are very specific evidence-based processes that reduce the symptomology. So that's also you being trauma informed as well. Next slide, Mary Beth. You can go to the next one. We covered this stuff. So these are those services that we were talking about earlier. Next slide, go ahead and go to the next one. I covered a lot of this. So this is the difference. You can be trauma informed and you're gonna have a response. And your response to being trauma informed, you don't have to be a therapist. You don't have to be a licensed mental health practitioner. You're really just gonna acknowledge what's happening inside of the environment that you're working with children in. You're going to validate them. You can empathize with them. You normalize the situation with them to try to get control of the trigger, and you support their basic needs. Whereas trauma-specific services, this is the difference. It's a process. So I assess what the issue and the behavior problem is inside of that child. I explore that behavior inside of that child in order to understand what's happening. And then I engage them in symptomology reduction. That could be like relaxation. That could be like good sleep hygiene. That could be like challenging cognitive distortions, things of that practice. And then I have them go home and apply those in their life, right? And see when they return, I question whether or not that is actually helping them whenever they experience traumatic stress in their life. The application of those things that I'm teaching you, is it working? So that's a trauma-specific services. The trauma-informed approach is just people who understand the impact of trauma on children and they respond to them appropriately. The trauma-specific side of that is an actual service that's being applied to them. So I just want to differentiate between the two. Next slide, Mary Beth. And then this is really your definition of a trauma-informed system. And I don't want to read this to you, but really it's all of us working collectively together to build an integrated response to children who have experienced traumatic stress. Most of the children who have experienced adverse childhood experiences and additional traumas that live outside of the adverse childhood experiences realm wind up developing ongoing long-term traumatic stress. What it is, it's not entirely post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so what we have to do is we have to build a system and a community response to that system in order to ensure that we're not working in silos in our trauma-informed approach and our trauma-specific approach, but that we're taking all of that collectively together and we're putting it together to create a system of care. And we do that through building trauma-informed organizations, and then those organizations collaborating with like-minded organizations to build that integrated approach. And I think from this point, Mary Beth, you were going to kind of talk about what we're doing in San Antonio in order to do that.
Thank you so much, Randy. And I believe our next section is Dr. Bridger to talk about the process as it's been historically to today, and then I'll round out with certification.
Yeah, so just to build on what Randy was describing, and also to say, San Antonio and Bexar County, I think, is fairly unique in how advanced we are in the creation of this system. A lot of places that I'm familiar with have started with just one aspect of trauma-informed care, and have focused on perhaps just one population, like kids in child protective services or foster kids, for example. What we did here in San Antonio is we are creating a system that does just what Randy has described for you. It has 3 critical components. We have a consortium for trauma-informed care, and the consortium consists of 600 different organizations that are all dedicated and committed to applying trauma-informed approaches in their work. And the individuals who are part of this consortium kind of see their role in the system as communicating why trauma-informed approaches are important. The next aspect we have in the system is the Institute for Trauma-Informed Care. And that organization provides training and technical assistance to agencies that wish to become trauma-informed. And so the way we describe that is that they're focused on the what does it take to be trauma-informed. And then the third leg of our three-legged stool is our certifying entity. And here in Bexar County, that is the Ecumenical Center. And they are the ones who assess and certify organizations as being trauma-informed. So if you're familiar with accreditation, for example, this is very similar to that process. It is a 10 to 15 month long process that organizations have to go through. So it's not a simple process. And Mary Beth's going to tell you a lot more about that. But those 3 organizations or components make up the system that we have here in Bexar County. Next slide, please. So I did want to talk a little bit about the consortium, or the why is this important, and the fact that we are focused on these 12 different sector work groups where we are all working on creating that trauma-informed care system. And so it ranges from, the early care and education to the justice system to the medical system to, congregations. And so this is something that we are actively engaging a variety of organizations and people to help convey that message of why it's important that every single organization in each of these sectors be trauma. Next slide, please. And then a little bit about the Institute for Trauma-Informed Care. So that is a partnership between the City of San Antonio and our public hospital, University Health System. It is a $1.2 million institute, and it, again, focuses on providing training and technical assistance at no cost to agencies that are looking to become ultimately trauma-informed care certified, but recognize that
I believe we lost Dr. Bridger.
oh no.
She's back now.
Okay. Sorry about that. It stopped raining, so I don't know what's going on. I think I'm about done. Next slide. So last is my segue to Mary Beth, which is the certifying entity. The Ecumenical Center, in partnership with Methodist Healthcare Ministries, is our certifying entity. And so in order to do that, they developed the certification standards and are assessing and certifying organizations as they go through the process as being trauma informed. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Mary Beth.
Thank you, Dr. Bridger. As we walk through the afternoon talk on trauma-informed care, we'd like to share with you the process of certification as it has evolved since the beginning of the work that came through the consortium and working in tandem with many of our partners here in the community. So the process of the certification as it has been laid out thus far is that the whole process begins by an organization who's interested in becoming certified as an organization. They submit an interest form. So they can go to the website www.ecrh.org, identify the interest form, fill that information out, and that gets them in line, if you will, for walking through the process of training, technical assistance, consultation, and ultimately certification. Where that interest form goes to, it notifies the certifying body, the Ecumenical Center. It also notifies the Institute for Trauma-Informed Care, who would provide the training. Each of the organization respectively then reaches back to the organization and really aligns their timeline for what they would like to see and when they would like to see that. On a routine basis, orientations are held for the agencies that have submitted their interest forms. That gives more information in a more group format. We have just recently combined these orientations with both the Institute and the certifying entity for ease of understanding and for ease of being able to ask questions that may be relevant or overlapping. The training and assessment organizations are, as far as the certifying process, what some of the things that we're going to look at and have conversation about is, have you trained your employees in the concepts of trauma-informed care? Have you integrated that into your system? Is that documented? And moving forward, not only with that, but also reviewing and looking at policies and procedures, physical plant, trustworthiness and choice within an organization, and ultimately a certification that includes a desk review and then a site visit. If there's more than one site, that may be more than one site visit. So the journey towards certification truly does begin with training, in the sense of training the staff. The leadership support and communication is ultimately essential. If the leaders of the organization are not committed to becoming a trauma-informed organization, we don't believe that they can successfully walk through this process. So that's critically important, and one of the things that we do look for is a commitment letter from the leader of the organization. Then, of course, a policy on trauma-informed care, its development, its implementation, that may vary from organization to organization, and we're not looking for any one prescriptive way, but we're looking at trauma-informed care being set as a priority within the organization and integrated throughout all processes. In many cases, an internal trauma-informed work group for an organization seeking certification will be a very helpful structure for them to go through. There may be also internal assessment with staff within the organization and an external assessment as well through self-evaluation. There'll be processes of management, measurement, and progress, and then a plan of action and implementation and communication. The one important thing to note is becoming trauma-informed certified is not about a checklist and checking off the things that you've done, but instead integrating it in your daily work and in your daily processes and procedures throughout the organization. For any organization of any type that's pursuing becoming trauma-informed and ultimately certified. Beyond in the certification process of creating a system of measurement and creating a system of standards for which compliance is sought, we knew that we needed to devise the domains for which these would fall. So these are the high-level areas that really do drive the standards within each level of certification. The first is safety, physical and interpersonal, emotional safety. The second is transparency and trustworthiness. Thirdly, respect and empowerment, collaboration and policy. The fifth, skill building and emotional intelligence. But very, very important to note is that cultural competency, equity, and choice are built into every single standard and must be proven through documentation of the standards and its compliance, because it's critically important to being able to become a trauma-informed organization. So we do have a certification guidance document. This is available in both English and in Spanish. It is something that's provided to organizations who've submitted an interest form that are interested in going through the certification orientation and ultimately making a decision as to whether or not they would like to pursue certification. For some, that's the right answer. For others, just integrating trauma-informed processes may be the direction that they want to go. But this particular document is available, and certainly through the process of submitting that interest form, you'll have access to that. We'll ultimately also be posting it on the website very shortly so that individuals can go through it. Important to note here, the requirements and readiness of the standards that are developed and published at this point are for level 1. We consider this to be the foundational level for certification in trauma-informed care. For some organizations, this will be the level that they pursue. For other organizations, they may want an advanced level. Level 2 and level 3 are in the works and being planned as we speak. So how does trauma-informed certification work? The goal is to build a strong foundation. The certification process is absolutely supportive. It is not punitive. It is not intended to call anyone out. There's no really complicated point structures. There's no charge for the certification. As Dr. Bridger had mentioned, within our organizations in the city, in Bexar County, at this point in time, it's at no cost to the individuals. And there's no one singular model. And by model, we're talking about the structure for how you organize internally to an organization, your efforts in trauma-informed care. For one organization, it may be led by their trauma-informed internal work group or committee, but by another, it may be led by another internal group. It's important to note that many of these processes, as Randy described earlier, organizations may have been trauma-informed for quite some time if it's the nature of the work that they do. And looking at ways that these are linked to the individual certification standards do help us just to draw that linkage without recreating something new and different. It's really just looking to verify that trauma-informed principles are integrated within the system of the operation. So there is a checklist. This is more of a self-evaluation tool that allows individuals to walk through. For example, if you look at the right-hand side of the slide, it's leadership commitment. Does the highest level of leadership within my organization believe this is the right step to take? Are they going to be willing to be supportive of that? Not just willing by allowing time for staff to be trained and so forth, but in some cases, there may be a cost of modification to your building or signage. So communication is critical. Having a change management process and then developing your implementation model, your change model, readiness assessment, which is also provided as a self-evaluation tool, well, along with measurement, evaluation, and documentation. So the self-evaluation, again, this is somewhat repetitive to what we just reviewed, but making sure these elements are integrated within the system. So last slide is we encourage anyone that has questions or has interest in learning more about trauma-informed care certification here in Bexar County, San Antonio, or even outside of Bexar County. We welcome any inquiry that you might have. You can reach us at the number that's noted on the slide. And at this time, our panelists are ready to take any questions that you might have about the ACEs, trauma-informed care, trauma-informed services, or certification. There is a question in the chat box I see from Jennifer. Can a private practice receive this certification? And the answer is yes. We have organizations in all different sizes that are signed up to go through the certification process. We have, in fact, our largest percentage of organizations signed up are from 1 to 9 employees. So the answer is absolutely yes, that is possible. We just certified our very first entity in Bear County and Methodist Healthcare Ministries and celebrated that this past Wednesday. I'll look to my colleagues to see if there are other questions that you see in the chat.
So there's a question about, is there a military link to the consortium? And not explicitly, it's not a sector. It is embedded in pretty much everything we do. The way we came up with the different sector work groups is a group of about 50 of us got together and mapped out all of the potential systems where kids interact with adults and want to make sure that those adults would be trauma informed. So we didn't carve out a number of different places, but I think we recognize as Military City USA that that's embedded in a number of those different areas. Lots of questions, Mary Beth, about the how do we get on the list to become certified? So can you talk about that?
Absolutely. I will put in the chat the website for which the easiest way to get that information is to submit a interest form online, and I will put in the chat the website to go for, and it is the trauma-informed interest form, trauma-informed certification interest form, and you'll get a call back from likely 2 different entities that are going to try to help have a conversation with you about what are your needs. Are you looking for training at this time? You're looking ultimately to become certified, and that way we get giving you all the information that is available and free of charge to you right now in Bear County. It's an admirable goal to become a trauma and certified Bear County.
Colleen, there's a question on here if there's any military link inside of any of the sector work groups. Are you aware of that happening in any one of those?
Yes. Did my audio not work when I answered that question? Oh no, doggone it. So yes, there is not a specific work group that focuses on the military, but military components, I think, are featured in every single one of the work groups. Much more succinct than the first time I answered. There's also a question from somebody from outside the state wanting to know if an organization could be certified in another state. So Mary Beth, do you want to take that one?
Absolutely. Absolutely. For anyone interested, we are going to make this process available to you. And so once again, if you can make contact, send us your interest form in, and we will reach back to you and have a conversation and better understand what your interests are and how we can best look to meet those.
There's another question on here, Dr. Bridger. Where do you see the work groups going in the future?
You know, I think that we need to continue to focus on the why is this important. I mentioned, I think Bear County is doing a phenomenal job in this systems approach, but we still have way too many components of that system that need to understand why it's important that they be trauma informed. So we need, you know, people to be really passionate about continuing to bring that message forward and share that with like-minded individuals. So there will, I think, always be room for the consortium to really kind of help people understand why it's so important that we all strive towards that trauma-informed practice.
I think there's a point of clarification and a question in the chat asking about individual certification. This program is intended for organizational certification in the universal precautions approach. And Dr. Bridger, could you speak more to the universal precautions approach that has been adopted in our county?
Yeah, that's been an interesting philosophical conversation that we've had, because there are some places, California comes to mind, that has pursued kind of this screening approach to trauma-informed practices. And, so there's an ACEs questionnaire and they administer it to kids, and then based on their score or their needs, they provide them with targeted services. And so that, that's one side of the philosophical debate. On the other side is this universal precautions approach, which is, if everybody is trauma informed all of the time, we don't have to screen kids. We don't have to put them through reliving and remembering the trauma associated with, whatever happened to them. And we are able to kind of avoid stigmatizing kids who've experienced trauma. The other thing that we talked about when we were going back and forth on the universal precautions versus, ACEs screening approach is making sure that we have all the resources that we need as we move forward. And so if we had a bunch of people starting to screen and then we didn't have, the trauma-informed interventions that Randy was talking about at a large enough scale, then we would be creating a situation where we might be actually creating more trauma as a result. So that's kind of a short answer to that question, but definitely here in Bexar County, we are taking a universal precautions approach to our trauma-informed care system.
I would encourage anyone who is interested in joining the consortium. Do we have the website, Mary Beth, that we can post if people are interested in doing that or becoming part of the sector work groups? And I really would impress upon people to understand where we are in this process, even though we are a few years now. Were we going on year 3 now, I think?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we've made a ton of strides. We are, the analogy I always like to give is I feel like we're turning a cruise ship. We're not turning a speedboat here. And so if you have expertise in the area and you would like to lend and assist, because I see a lot of people on here talking about the wonderful things that they've done within their own practices and the own certifications that they have, and some people asking or requesting how they become trainers, we would welcome, I know inside of our government, I work in the government sector work group, individuals to bring that expertise. And if I'm not mistaken, I do believe that the institute itself, which is the University Health System, is seeking out additional trainers. They are trying to build a training platform. They don't believe in recreating the wheel. They want to utilize the individuals inside of our community who are already the experts in this field. And so I would highly encourage you, if you are interested in providing training, as somebody had requested on here or suggested on here, that you reach out to the institute, because they'd probably be more than willing to work with you.
Yeah, and speaking of training, we do have, 50 or so individuals who've been through the ACEs interface training. We do want to make sure that you meet a certain minimum standard before are out there training on behalf of the consortium. And also want to make sure that people understand that this is all free, right? You don't get paid for being a trainer. You don't get paid for being on the consortium. This is all a bunch of people in the community who are working together to improve the community. So that is something else that I think is important to remind individuals is you're welcome to come roll up your sleeves and work with us. It's a labor of love.
I believe the contact person at University Health System is Belinda, but what's Belinda's last name? Rattenberry, is that correct? Yes. Belinda Rattenberry, somebody had asked to get in contact with over there.
There's another question in the Q&A section. And what the question is, it only for LPC, or what are their credentials? I'm an LCDC. I don't know if we're talking about the CEUs from the days offering, or if you're looking at the certification piece or training piece. If you could kindly clarify, we'd be happy to do our best to answer your question. A second question is, are there different considerations to be made when certifying organizations that offer solely virtual services? Certification can also be done, of course, whatever service line you're in, whether you're a mental health counseling organization where you're doing virtual services or in-person services, or you're a early childhood development center or a school or a bank. I mean, these principles can apply really to anyone, as Randy had pointed out in his sector. So as far as certification for LCDCs, our program is intended to certify at an organizational level. So if you're a small organization of one or two or three, that's fine. There are other resources out across the communities of North America that will provide you individual trainings, and they have different titles for that. But please contact us and we can talk about your unique situation and walk through that together. Thank you, Randy, for posting the Institute information in the chat. We also have posted for you the website for the South Texas Trauma Informed Consortium, as mentioned earlier, if you're interested in joining a work group. If you're interested in certification or training, all of those have been listed in the chat today.
I would also preference that if you've been dropped off any of the listservs or haven't received contact, COVID threw a big wrench in a number of things, and some of the meetings were actually postponed or put off, and we're trying to get back on board with those. So the larger consortium meeting. So I think there was actually a couple months there we didn't have any, and so now they're starting to come back online. So please be patient, and if you are kicked off of that, please reach out again, and I'm sure we'll get you on the listserv again.
And I think some of us, including myself, didn't hit everyone when we were posting some of the links. And so I'm going back and redoing some of them because they were just going to hosts and panelists. So apologies for that.
Oh, yes.
We should be much more facile with technology post-COVID, but we're still learning.
I think there's an interesting thing happening with the chat too, because I'm getting questions later than you guys are, I think, as well.
It must be the storm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other gremlins somewhere along the way. But we're grateful to each and every one of you for joining this conversation this afternoon. I'm sure that if there are other questions, we're happy to answer them. Also happy to have conversation after this time together today.
And Mary Beth, will the slides be on some website somewhere?
Yes, the sessions are being recorded so that individuals can go back. If we missed segments, I know we had some outages for some of our folks, so you can go back and review those, and the slides are also available through the Pathways to Hope website.
All right.
Great. Well, I'm going to ask our distinguished speakers today if they can give us a closing thought. Randy, would you like to go first?
Sure. I would just, let you guys know that if you are an organization that is interested in becoming trauma informed, understand that it is a large undertaking. It's not just a matter of saying that you're going to do something. It will change your entire organization. And here's the beautiful thing about becoming trauma informed. It doesn't just assist those youth and children who have been impacted by trauma. It helps the frontline staff who you are involved with. It helps the caregivers. It helps the partners that you work with. You see, I think, an uptick in just employee satisfaction inside of the workplace because they are given a voice. So the support is broad, and it's a wide-reaching support. It is a heavy lift. There's no extra cost financially beyond the time and the effort that we have to put in, but the rewards and the benefits are well worth it, and we'll all be a better community for it if we do it.
Thank you.
And I will add to that, as the person who oversaw the pandemic response for the city of San Antonio and Bexar County for the last 18 months, I feel like I should address the trauma associated with COVID-19. I think one of our tri-chairs, Dr. Fletcher, mentioned that 1 in 8 children have lost either a parent or a grandparent as a result of COVID-19 in the United States. And so we need to think about how we're prepared to deal with that trauma on top of all of the other traumatic experiences that are increasing. The number of people dealing with anxiety and depression is, skyrocketing. Suicides are increasing. And so, if ever there were a time to be focused on being trauma sensitive or trauma informed, or appropriately utilizing trauma-informed therapeutic practices, now is the time to do that. So, if you're not sure whether you want to invest in making this happen, and again, the only investment is your time, but it's not nothing. It's a pretty significant investment of time. Now is the perfect time to do that. And we're here to help. And definitely want to make all of the resources that we have available to you and help you through that journey.
Thank you all as well, and Dr. Bridger and Randy McGibeny for your expertise in this particular area. And we know that it'll make it for a healthier San Antonio, a healthier community for all, as we each take on and move forward with trauma-informed care in our respective areas. The question related to training, I'll repost the Institute's website so that you can find that information out, and then perhaps ask the question in that direction of how do I find a list of organizations that may have completed training in Bexar County. So that's now in. I think there's one more comment that just came in. COVID related, Dr. Bridger. Certainly, we appreciate, Dr. Bridger, your leadership through COVID, and we know that was no small task, and that you've continued to share this vision of a trauma-informed certified community that will make us all healthier, and especially after the pandemic. Thank you again for all of your time spent there, and now your time providing consultation in San Antonio to programs. We're grateful for your leadership, and Randy, grateful for how you take care of our children in our community who need us most. Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.